The first time Lewis Hamilton drove the 2026 Ferrari, he said something he had not said in years. "This car talks to me. I like the way it moves around." For a driver coming off the worst season of his career, no podiums, openly questioning whether he still had it, that sentence should have been impossible. So how does a 41-year-old, written off by half the paddock, end up winning a Grand Prix by almost 20 seconds, the oldest race winner the sport has seen since 1970? The answer is not the car alone, and it is not the driver alone. It is the way the two finally fit, and it starts with how he brakes. Here is the part that almost nobody framed correctly at the time. The thing that won him Barcelona is the same thing that made him look slow for 4 straight years: his driving style. Specifically, the way he attacks a corner. Hamilton brakes later than almost anyone on the grid, and he brakes hard, loading the front of the car into the turn and trusting the rear to follow. When it works, it is the fastest way through a corner that exists. When the car cannot support it, the same inputs look ragged and nervous, a tenth slow everywhere. For most of the ground effect era, the car could not support it. By the end of 2025, his first year in red, Hamilton had finished a full season without a single podium for the first time in his career. The radio had gone quiet. The talk in the paddock was about whether the move to Ferrari had been a mistake, whether the speed was simply gone. None of that talk accounted for one detail. The rules were about to change, and the style everyone wanted him to soften was about to become an advantage. To see why, you have to look at what aggression actually means inside a Formula One car, because it is not a personality trait, it is a measurable set of inputs. A late braker carries speed deeper into the braking zone, then asks the front tyres to do an enormous amount of work in a very short window. For that to pay off, the front of the car has to bite the instant he turns in and hold its line while the rear stays just loose enough to rotate. Drivers call it a pointy front end. Hamilton has built his entire career around it. He needs the car to change direction the moment he asks, and he is willing to manage a rear that moves around underneath him to get it. You can see the difference in a single number that engineers obsess over, the point at which a driver lifts off the brake and the car begins to turn. Hamilton's brake trace stays high and late, then releases sharply as he tips the car into the corner, a technique called trail braking that keeps weight over the front tyres right up to the apex. Done well, it is devastatingly fast. Done in a car that will not rotate, it simply scrubs speed and wears the fronts to nothing. The same input is a gift or a punishment, depending entirely on what the car does next. Charles Leclerc, his teammate, drives the same machinery a different way. He brakes earlier and smoother, carrying more speed through the middle of the corner, using the engine and the rear of the car to rotate rather than a violent turn of the wheel. By reputation, he is one of the smoothest drivers on the brakes in the sport. 2 world-class drivers, 1 car, 2 completely different sets of demands placed on it. Across the garage at Mercedes, George Russell sits at a third point, quick and precise, but more exposed when the grip falls away and the rear starts sliding in high temperatures. Hold that detail. Because in Barcelona the track climbed past 50 degrees, and the way a driver lives with a sliding rear in the heat decided the race. Hamilton's whole style is built on a moving rear. For him, that is not a problem to survive, it is the window he drives in. So why did the same style look so ordinary for 4 years? The answer sits in the floor of the car. From 2022 onward, Formula One ran heavy ground effect machines that made their grip from a stiff, low platform sealed close to the track. To work that floor, teams ran the cars rigid and low, and the reward went to drivers who were smooth, who kept the platform stable, who never upset it with sudden inputs. That is the opposite of how Hamilton drives. Every hard stab at the brake, every aggressive turn-in, disturbed exactly the platform those cars depended on. He spent those seasons fighting the machine instead of attacking the track. At Mercedes, the car bounced and slid and never gave him the front end he needed. Then he moved to Ferrari for 2025. And the problem followed him, because the new car carried the same ground effect approach and the same demand for a calm, planted style. The 2025 Ferrari was a particularly cruel fit. It needed to be run low and stiff to find its lap time, and the lower it ran, the more it punished a driver who leaned on the front and asked the rear to follow. Hamilton found himself backing out of the very inputs that made him Hamilton, driving around the car's weaknesses instead of through his own strengths. The results told the story without mercy. Out-qualified and outscored by Leclerc across the year, no podiums, a driver who had won more races than anyone in history, suddenly looking like a passenger. By the time the season closed, Hamilton had gone more than a year and a half without a win, a drought, stretching back to the summer of 2024 and his final victory in Mercedes colours. More than 40 races had passed. For a driver with over 100 wins to his name, that kind of silence stops reading like a slump and starts reading like a question mark over an entire chapter of his career. This is the version of Hamilton the paddock carried into 2026, slower, older, a legacy signing that had not worked. What that red missed is that almost none of it was about age, and almost none of it was about the talent leaving. It was about a style and a set of rules pulling in opposite directions, and one of those two things was about to disappear. For 2026, the rule book was torn up. New cars, lighter and shorter, with active wings and a completely different balance of power and aerodynamics. The detail that matters for this story is narrow and specific. The new generation moved away from the extreme ground effect platform that had defined the previous 4 seasons. The cars no longer demanded that a driver tiptoe around a rigid floor. They moved around more, and they rewarded a driver who could attack, place the car, and live with a rear that talked back. In other words, the rules quietly handed Hamilton the kind of car his style had been asking for since 2021. There is a second piece to the fit. Beyond the floor. The 2026 cars are lighter and more compact than the heavy machines they replaced, quicker to change direction and more willing to be thrown into a corner. A heavier car resists a driver who wants to attack. A lighter, sharper one rewards him. For a driver whose entire advantage lives in the speed of his hands and the timing of his inputs, taking weight off the car is like handing a boxer back his reach. He did not design that change. Nobody at Ferrari sat down and built a car around the way he drives. The real story is more interesting than that. The regulations shifted for everyone, and the shift happened to swing the door open for the one driver on the grid whose natural style had been locked out the longest. Good fortune and good timing met a driver who knew exactly what to do with both. And here is the part that turns timing into results. Hamilton did not just receive a friendlier car and sit in it. He had spent the entire previous year, through all the losing, telling the team exactly what he needed the car to feel like. He was not handing engineers blueprints. He was telling them what the car had to do under his hands, corner by corner, and pushing for the changes that would make it happen. When the new rules arrived, Ferrari already had a long list of exactly what their struggling signing had been asking for. The first sign that it had worked came before the season even started, on a quiet shakedown lap at Barcelona months earlier. Hamilton climbed out and said the car talked to him, that he liked the way it moved around. To anyone outside the garage, that sounds like a throwaway line. Inside the sport, it is one of the most important things a driver can say. It means the car is feeding him information through the steering and the seat, telling him where the grip is before he loses it, letting him lean on the front the way he has his whole career. For 4 years he had been driving cars that went silent on him at the worst possible moment, that gave no warning before the grip vanished. A car that talks is a car a driver like Hamilton can attack. He can brake later because he can feel the limit coming. He can rotate harder because he trusts the rear to tell him the truth. That feeling did not show up immediately on the results sheet. What followed was a slow climb rather than a sudden switch. A podium in China early in the year, his first in Ferrari colours, hinted at what the car could be. The middle of the season wobbled. A flat run through Japan and Miami, where the package and the weekends refused to come together. Then the form arrived in a sequence the paddock could no longer explain away. Second place in Canada, second again in Monaco, 3 podiums in a row leading into Barcelona. Each weekend, the car felt more like his, and each weekend, he pulled a little more out of it. The win was not a bolt from nowhere. It was the moment a rising line finally crossed into first place. The clearest evidence that Hamilton was reshaping this car around his style sits in a part hardly any fan thinks about: the brakes. Ferrari had run the same brake supplier for years, a relationship as old and as Italian as the team itself. Hamilton arrived using a different set of carbon discs, the ones he had relied on at Mercedes, made by a French manufacturer called Carbone Industrie. The difference between the two is not really about stopping power on paper. It is about bite, the way the brake grabs in the first instant of pressure. Hamilton's late braking style lives or dies in that instant. He needs the brake to respond the moment he asks, because he is asking later than almost anyone, with less road left to slow the car. From the Japanese Grand Prix onward, Ferrari switched him onto the discs that suit how he drives. It was not a small or simple decision. Changing a brake supplier on one car cuts against a partnership the team had protected for a long time, and it caused real friction inside Maranello. They did it anyway, because the data and the driver agreed. The team had decided that getting the most out of Hamilton was worth disturbing something that had been settled for years. That is the moment the relationship between driver and car flipped. Up to that point, Hamilton had been adapting to Ferrari. Now Ferrari was adapting to Hamilton. And the brake change was not the end of it. It was the signal. Leclerc, who had complained about his own brakes after a difficult weekend in Monaco, later moved toward the same setup himself. The aggressive driver had not just found a car he could use. He was pulling the whole program toward the way he works. If you're getting something out of this breakdown, the kind of detail the race day coverage skips over, take a second to subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel keep digging into the engineering behind the results. While Hamilton was pulling the brake program toward his style, a larger shift was happening in the development direction of the entire car. He spent his difficult first year doing something that never shows up on a results sheet. He was logging, in obsessive detail, every trait of the car that fought against him and pushing the team to attack those traits one by one. When the 2026 innovations started appearing, a redesigned rear exhaust vane, a trick-rotating rear wing the team nicknamed the Macarena that flips fully over to cut drag on the straights, Hamilton's response was blunt. "This," he said, "is what I was asking for last year." That line matters because of what it does and does not claim. He was not the engineer who drew those parts. He was the driver who had defined the problem clearly enough and pushed hard enough that the solutions were already on the list when the rules opened the door. There is a version of this story where a driver simply gets lucky with a regulation change. This is not quite that version. The luck was real, but the team walked into the new era already carrying a detailed map of what their fastest configuration looked like, drawn from a year of one driver refusing to accept the car as it was. By the time the big upgrade arrived, the direction was set. The only question left was whether the parts would deliver the performance the feel had been promising. The upgrade Ferrari brought to Barcelona was the largest package the team produced all season. A revised front wing, a completely redesigned floor, reworked from the leading edge all the way back to the diffuser. New bodywork around the side pods. On paper, it was a broad aerodynamic step, more load across the range of speeds where the car actually operates, and it showed up instantly. In qualifying, the Ferrari was right on the pace. Hamilton lining up second, separated from pole by 0.06 of a second. But the most important change in Barcelona was one Ferrari never listed on its official upgrade sheet. The team had quietly fitted new rear wheel rims, built to manage heat differently and pull temperature away from the rear tyres. On most weekends, that is a footnote. In Barcelona, with the track climbing past 50 degrees and tyres falling apart under the strain, it was the difference between winning and finishing fourth. Think about what that thermal change does for a driver who lives with a moving rear. The biggest threat to an aggressive style in extreme heat is a rear tyre that overheats and starts sliding out of control. Cool that tyre even slightly, give the rear a more stable platform deep into a stint, and you hand Hamilton exactly the conditions his style needs to do damage. While the cars around him cooked their tyres and slid, his car kept its rear under him. Rival teams noticed. Within days, the paddock was talking about a quiet development race over wheel and rim design, with at least one of Ferrari's competitors understood to be chasing the same thermal trick for the very next round. A part that never made an official upgrade list had become one of the most watched components on the grid. The aggression that punished Hamilton for 4 years finally had a machine that could carry it for an entire race distance in the worst possible conditions. On race day, everything the season had been building toward came together in a single afternoon. Hamilton started second, on a set of used soft tyres, a planned gamble that traded a little early grip for strategic freedom. Ferrari had committed to an aggressive 3-stop plan, a strategy that only works if the driver can push flat out, lap after lap, without destroying his tyres. For a lot of drivers in that heat, that is a fast way to fall backwards. The heat was punishing the entire field, tyres going off a cliff, lap times tumbling for drivers who had started strong. The conditions wrecking everyone else's race were the exact conditions Ferrari had quietly built this car to survive. For a driver whose car was now keeping its rear alive, the 3-stop was not a risk. It was a weapon. He used the soft start to apply pressure immediately, forcing Mercedes to respond, then worked through the stops while the cars around him struggled with degradation. The decisive moment came near 2/3 distant. An Aston Martin stopped out on track and brought out a virtual safety car, which slows the entire field and makes a pit stop far cheaper in lost time. Ferrari called Hamilton in instantly. He took fresh tyres at a fraction of the usual cost and rejoined with the race in his hands. Every driver around him had to weigh the same gamble, and most hesitated. Ferrari did not. The call was made in the time it takes to say it, and that decisiveness on the pit wall, paired with a driver who could lean on cold tyres without easing into them, turned a lucky break into a winning one. From there, it was not close. He pulled away from George Russell at a pace nobody else could match, managing the gap exactly as the pit wall asked, pushing when told to push and saving the car when told to save. The aggression was still there in every braking zone, but it was controlled now, aimed, spent only where it bought time. By the flag, the margin was almost 20 seconds. 19.5 to be exact, over the second-placed car. A driver who had not won a race in nearly 2 years, who had not stood on a podium in his entire first Ferrari season, had just driven away from a Grand Prix field. The records that fell that afternoon read like a career summary dropped into a single race. It was Hamilton's 106th Grand Prix victory, and his first in Ferrari red. At 41, he became the oldest driver to win a Formula One race since Jack Brabham in 1970, more than half a century ago. Behind him, Russell and Lando Norris completed the podium, the first time 3 British drivers had filled all 3 steps since 1968, a gap of 58 years. With that win, he also became the first driver in the history of the sport to win Grand Prix in his 20s, his 30s, and his 40s. 3 decades of victories spread across his career. And there was an echo that Ferrari fans caught immediately. The last time a driver took his first Ferrari win at this exact circuit, it was Michael Schumacher in 1996, the start of the most successful partnership the team has ever known. There was one more twist that afternoon, and it reshaped the championship. The runaway points leader, Kimi Antonelli, was running a strong second with a handful of laps left when his car failed underneath him, a sudden power unit problem that ended his race on the spot. Hamilton inherited even more margin, and the title picture tightened in an instant. Antonelli's lead, which had looked huge, was cut to 41 points, with Hamilton climbing to second in the standings. It also moved Hamilton clear of his own teammate. The driver who had been completely outperformed by Leclerc through all of 2025 now sat ahead of him, the established Ferrari leader suddenly looking up at the new arrival. None of those numbers happened because of luck alone. They happened because a style that had been a liability for 4 years finally had a car underneath it that could use every part of it. It would be easy, after a result like that, to declare the problem solved and the comeback complete. The team is careful not to. Their own leadership has been blunt that one win does not make everything magic, that the season before was not suddenly erased by a single afternoon in Spain. They are right to be cautious. One race in extreme heat, helped by a rival's failure and a perfectly timed safety car, is evidence, not proof. But the deeper shift is real. And it is mechanical rather than emotional. The rules changed in a way that rewards how Hamilton drives. The team changed the brakes to suit how he stops the car. The development direction followed the map he spent a losing year drawing. And the biggest upgrade of the year arrived with a hidden thermal trick that protects exactly the part of the car his style stresses most. Next comes the Austrian Grand Prix at the Red Bull Ring, a shorter, sharper circuit that asks different questions. Hard braking into slow corners and traction out of them, exactly the kind of layout. A strong front end and a late brake by real time. The Red Bull Ring belongs, on recent form, to Max Verstappen, who has won there more than any current driver and treats the place as home soil. Beating a car like that on a power circuit is a different test from winning in the heat of Barcelona, but the shape of the season has changed. There are still well over a dozen races to run, the title is no longer a runaway, and Ferrari now arrive at every weekend with a driver who trusts that the car will answer when he pushes it. Hamilton sits 41 points behind in the championship, which is a long way back this early. A month ago, that gap looked like a formality. Now it looks like a target. For the first time since he pulled on a Ferrari suit, the car is working with him instead of against him. Go back to that first quiet lap at Barcelona, the shakedown nobody outside the garage paid attention to. This car talks to me. I like the way it moves around. At the time, it sounded like a driver trying to stay positive after a brutal year. Months later, it reads like the first accurate scouting report on a championship contender. The car had been telling him the truth from the very first lap. It just took the rest of the grid until June to hear it. A great driver and a great car still have to fit together, and for 4 years Hamilton had the talent and the wrong machine. In 2026, the rules, the team, and a year of stubborn feedback finally handed him both at once. If you want the technical breakdowns, the mainstream coverage skips, the telemetry, the setup, the engineering behind the headlines, subscribe and stay with the channel. This season is only getting started.